Tituba, Black Witch of Salem discussion. Let's get into it. So we're going to talk today about Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. And let me tell y'all, this book has had a hold on me this week. And so I just wanted to get on. I'm on live. I'm also on YouTube to just talk about this book and how it has really just has me all in my feelings. Hey, how are you doing? Good to see you. So we are talking Tituba, Black Witch of Salem today. So let me just give a little bit of background of how I got into this book and why I'm talking about it. So I'm reading with my sister. This book is called African Goddess Initiation. And so it features several different historical figures and other figures and gets in and presents them as goddesses, right? So there are different rituals. It's a beautiful book, so we've been getting into it. So like last week we were talking about Sarji Bartman or Sarah Bartman, who's also known as the Hottentot Venus. And so we got into that a little bit, and I talked a little bit about her because Beauvoir, there's like a passing mention of her in some of like the Negritude poetry and some things like that. So I'll talk about it a little bit in my Beauvoir and Belle book. Yes. So I haven't read it in like 30 years. I'm not sure if you're talking about the African Goddess one or the Tituba book. So the African Goddess one I'm reading for the first time. The Tituba book was assigned to me in African Diaspora in the World when I was my first year in college 30 years ago. And so I say that to say in the African Goddess Initiation book, this week the goddess is Tituba. Yes, the Condé book. So Maurice Condé's Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. So Tituba is the goddess in the African Goddess Initiation book this week. And I was like, oh, I definitely remember having this book for African Diaspora in the World. So of course I went back, I found the book. I was like, it wasn't on the bookshelf where I thought it would be, but it was actually in my my youngest room because sharing is caring. So there's some really good, powerful books in my 13-year-old's room. So I went and got the book, and so I started reading it. Let me preface this by saying there are plenty of brilliant scholars who have written brilliant and amazing things about the book, and so I'm probably not even going to get into the things that the brilliant scholars have written about the book. As a baseline, it's definitely a commentary on, it's based in the 1600s, like the late 1600s. So it's looking at some of the earlier stages of the development of slavery and colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade and things like that. So it starts out in Barbados, and then it follows. So Tituba is a Black woman who was accused of witchcraft in Salem during the Salem witch trials, right? And so it kind of traces her story from, like, her mother is from West Africa. Her mother is basically sexually assaulted by one of the sailors on the ship, I believe, like when she was going from Western Africa to Barbados. So she shows up like in Barbados pregnant, is depressed, dealing with all of the, the aftermath of that trauma. Ends up being given to another man who's enslaved as his wife, and he loves her. He takes care of her. He takes care of this kid as his own. So Tituba is the daughter of Abina, I believe is her mother's name. And then, so spoilers, right? If you haven't read this book and you don't want to hear any spoilers, then stop listening, because I'm not going to edit any of it. I'm just kind of going through some of what's happening in the book. So Abina then, becomes more healthy, all of these other kinds of things. Hey, good to see everybody. I'm glad everybody's here. And so, but then a slave master again tries to, a white man who is an enslaver again tries to rape her, and she fights back. And so she fights him, and the punishment for her fighting him instead of being raped by him is that she ends up being lynched. She's hung like in front of her daughter. So Tituba like sees her mother get lynched for fighting back this white man who tries to rape her. And then her father ends up also committing suicide, right? So she's, very young. And then some things happen with like the plantation. She's able to leave the plantation. And so she gets taken in by like a Black woman who's like in the Maroon community, like Mama Yaya, I think is her name. And so Mama Yaya takes her in as like she's her spiritual mother. She teaches her all kinds of things about, herbs and remedies and different sacred practices and things like that. And so then Mama Yaya eventually dies, but she's living like in this community that she's built a home for herself based on what Mama Yaya has told her, and she's living in freedom on her own, living as well as one can live under the circumstances of, like, again, emerging slavery, colonialism. She is no longer enslaved, right? She's living in this kind of maroon existence where she's able to sustain herself and all these kind of things. And then what happens? she meets a man. And so this is what I want to get into, because the book is, of course, broadly about these issues of slavery, colonialism, the New World. Hey, good to see you. But it's also this interesting commentary on marriage and choices and connections to our mothers and our intuition and our spirit guides and all of those things. And so that's what I want to get into it, because when I started reading this book, again, this was assigned to me 30 years ago when I was still in college, and I'm confident I was not thinking about the themes that I'm thinking about today 30 years ago when this book was first assigned in African diaspora in the world. So things that really stood out to me in this book, one has to do with, again, being connected to these spiritual practices and sacred practices, our connections to our mothers, both our biological mothers as well as spiritual mothers, our connection to ourselves and our intuition. Hey, I am doing well. It's good to see you too. Our connection to ourselves and our intuition, and the times when we like hit override on our intuition, where we like know internally something is wrong here, I should not do this thing, but we allow somebody else to talk us out of the thing that we know internally, right? And so there are these moments with Tituba where like she knows within herself, she has this intuitive sense of like, I should not do this thing. She even seeks the guidance of her spiritual guides, who again, her mother has passed, but her mother, she still is connected to her spiritually, so she can still communicate with her mother, her biological mother, Abina, and she can also still communicate with Mama Yaya, her spiritual mother. And they're both like, girl, don't do this, reconsider. And she's like, but I love him. And it's just one of those moments where you're just like, why do we do this to ourselves? And so what is really brought up for me, and I realized why I was so uncomfortable with it, because I was very annoyed with Tituba and some of the choices that she made. Again, she's this powerful woman. She has these spiritual practices. She's connected to her spirit guides. And she gets caught up with this man, like multiple men, multiple times, that really just throws her off track and takes her off her game. And I realized I was so frustrated with her, because in so many ways I have been her, right? And so Maurice Condé has like held up a mirror to decisions that I have made in my own life, in terms of my decision to get married, my decision to marry the person that I married, my decision to stay married as long as I stayed married. And then finally listen to my intuition, my spirit guides, to become happily unmarried and delightfully divorced, right? So I just want to read some of the passages that stood out to me. I have them tabbed here, but some things that stood out to me that I just wanted to get into and talk to. And of course, if you got relatable, yes, definitely. We've so been there. I know. And it's just like you live and you learn. And but I was just like, when I started reading it, I was just like, why is this thing disturbing me so much? And I was just like, oh, because like I have been there. And it's like, why do we do this to ourselves? But I do appreciate, and I should also say, so we don't have a lot of historical information about Tituba, right? And so I love that Maurice Condé is engaging in this kind of like speculative fiction, or what does Sadia Hartman calls it, critical fabulation, where it's like you only have so much information available through the archive that's given to you. And so you have to kind of use your own critical thinking and analysis and imagination in order to construct a story. And so I love the way Maurice Condé does this. And she says in a comment at the front of the text that, hold on, let me actually find that too, from Maurice Condé. So she says, this is the author, Maurice Condé. She says, Tituba and I lived for a year on the closest of terms. During our endless conversation, she told me things she had confided in nobody else, right? And so Maurice Condé is sharing this kind of spiritual connection that she felt with Tituba as she was writing this book. So I appreciate what she does writing the book. Okay, so let's get into, I'll tell you the first time when I was just like, please don't do this, reconsider. And she doesn't anyway, right? So this is early on. We're on like page 18 in the book. So I guess she meets this man, this guy who's like, funny, humorous or whatever, who's basically like, you look a mess because you're living out in the woods. You could be cuter if you tried a little harder, but it piques her interest. It piques her attention. So now suddenly she's like interested in this man, right? And so she says, so he invites her to a party or something like that. She goes to the party. There's some other woman there who he's dancing with, who he leaves when Tituba comes, but clearly there's something going on with him and this other woman, right? But he's basically a player, right? Like he's out here with all of the women. And so he basically invites her to abandon her freedom and her solitude, right? She has this kind of maroon situation that she has going on, where she's like outside of the system of slavery. She's not enslaved by anybody, or does not have to be on a plantation. He is enslaved. He is on a plantation with like this white woman, whose husband I think must have died or something like that. And he basically, the invitation is for Tituba to leave her freedom, to leave her peace and solitude, to be his wife and to be enslaved on this plantation. And it's just like, girl, what are you doing? Like, why do we give up our freedom in order to enter into this relationship with bondage, right? And so I think there's definitely a metaphor happening there between marriage and bondage. But I love, like, of course, I critique Simone de Beauvoir in this analogy of race and gender, as well as the analogy that a lot of white women make between marriage and slavery. But I think what's powerful about what Maryse Condé is doing is that she's looking at the actual system of slavery, right? So there's not this metaphor, there's not just a metaphor for marriage and slavery, there's actually a system of enslavement that's happening. And there are these parallels between Tituba's decision to leave her freedom in order to get married, to literally, so she's like, there's this metaphorical enslavement of becoming a wife and getting married, but then there's the actual literal chattel slavery that's happening, because she basically has to go into servitude for this white woman because she's married this black man who is her slave, right? Yeah, so it's both a figurative and a literal plantation. Exactly. So she has this moment. So Tituba does, she knows internally she's not supposed to, there's something in her that's just like, don't do it. Her mother says, girl, don't do it. Her spiritual mother says, girl, don't do it. But they're like, fine, why do we women get caught up with these men? Whatever, you're going to do whatever you're going to do. We'll support you to the best that we can, right? So she gets into, so this is Tituba talking to, I think John Indian is the dude's name. So he's trying to explain to her that, or he's trying to explain to Tituba that his white mistress is a good woman. So he says, I belong to Susanna Endicott, but she's a good mistress. And so Tituba's like, how can a mistress be good? Like, there is no such thing as a good mistress, right? Like, you literally are engaging in trafficking humans, right? And so, they go back and forth about that. And so this is what Tituba says. This is on page 18. And I think this is the 1992 English translation. So she says, I knew I should have fled. Instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, passive and adoring. And I just was like fighting back tears on that point. Like, girl, what are you doing? But it's like, there's so many moments that we have when we know we should walk away, run away, get away from the situation, and we stay stuck, we stay rooted, and we're like admiring the very thing that is going to bring us harm, ultimately. And so she says, or he says to her, don't you want me? He whispered against my neck, and therein lay my misfortune. I wanted that man as I had never wanted anyone else, right? So anyway, the long story short, she overrides her intuition, and she goes to the plantation and becomes enslaved, right? So this is the other part that got me, right? Like, again, her intuition told her no. Her biological mother told her no. Her spiritual mother told her no. She decided to do it anyway. And then she reflects on it. She says, so he gets upset because she's not sure if she's going to go, she ends up going, but she like has this moment where she's like, I'll give you an answer in a week. So he gets upset. He leaves in a rage. So in a rage, he picked up his straw hat. What was there about John Indian to make me so sick with love for him? Not very tall, average height, 5'7", not very big, not ugly, not handsome either. A fine set of teeth, burning eyes. I must confess, it was downright hypocritical of me to ask myself such a question, since I knew all too well where his main asset lay, and I dare not look below the jute cord that held up his shorts, his tight-fitting trousers, to the huge bump of his penis, right? So this is where the erotic empowerment part comes in. So what I love, and Angela Davis has a preface to this book where she points this out, that there is a full engagement with Tituba as a sexual being, right? So there is, of course, this account of sexual exploitation that happens in the context of slavery and the slave trade and colonialism. But there is also this erotic empowerment, right? So she like sexually desires this man. She's like, he's average. I mean, he's not ugly, but he's not that good looking. But his assets are, in his pants. Like, I wanted to have sex with him. So this is what it came down to for her. And so, but again, for this, like for his penis, she literally gives up her freedom living in, as a maroon outside of the slave plantation. Okay, so that's the first part. Okay, but then also on page 19, she says, so then her mother comes. Hold on, let me find this spot. So she says, I barely arrived home when Mama Yaya, who was in no hurry to listen to me and appeared with a frown on her face. What do you want now? Haven't you got all you wanted? He's asking me to live with him, she's explained to Mama Yaya. And she says, you know very well I don't want to return to the white man's world. I said very quietly, there's no way of escaping it. There's no way of escaping it. Why? I shouted. Can't you bring him here? And so it's basically she's trying to get Mama Yaya to like bring him to her instead of her having to go to him. But of course that doesn't work out. And so she says, despite all of that, so she's reflecting on also like her experience with her mother. And so she says she'd been hanged because of a white man. I had seen his tongue quiver out his mouth, his penis turgid and violent. My adoptive father had committed suicide because of a white man. Despite all that, I was considering living among white men again, in their midst, under their dominion, and all because of an uncontrollable desire for a mortal man. Wasn't it madness and betrayal? So that's the other thing that stood out to me, like for her to describe her own sense of madness at being willing to give up her freedom for this man, as well as her self-betrayal. Like, again, she names it. So I appreciate that Condé has her very like introspective and self-reflective and communicating to the reader, like that she's actually considering all these things. She's not necessarily naively making these decisions, right? Like she's fully conscious of the decisions that she's making and the consequences, and she's aware of that for herself, as well as because, again, her biological mother, her spiritual mother, who are both spirit guides at this point and ancestors, are, warning her. Okay, so she ends up marrying him, and then it's in this context, she gets into it with the white woman mistress. And so they end up being sold off, and this is what gets her and the husband from Barbados to Massachusetts in America. And that's where things go down in terms of like the accusation of witchcraft and all of that kind of stuff. I'm not actually going to get into that because I really do want to focus on the Happily Unmarried, Unhappily Married part and the Erotic Empowerment part. So then something else that happens is interesting to me is that, he wanted this woman, he has this woman, she has given up her freedom for this woman. And she has been wild and free. He knows that she's a quote unquote witch, right? Like she's accused of being, even in Barbados, she's described as a witch by him and by other people. And she pushes back on that language. Like, well, what does that even mean? Like people who are accused of being witches are actually helping people. And there's a point when he says to her, come, my little wild mare, let me tame you. And that's something else that pissed me off, because it's just like, people, like, he knew the power that she had. He knew the freedom that she had. And he not only required that she give up that freedom in order to be with him, but also desires to tame her, to bring her, to take away her light, to bring her down a peg or two. So that was something else that I just was like shaking my head on. That's on page 23. And then she kind of juxtaposes this, like he explicitly says, come on, Mare, let me tame you. But then he like will bring her food in bed, and he's good in bed, right? Like, so the sex is great. She's like, he treats me like a goddess, but he literally is showing you who he is by like forcing you to give up not forcing you, but asking you to give up your freedom in order to be with him. And then basically saying outright that he wants to tame her, right? So then again, she's so self-reflective, and this is just in the first 25 pages. We haven't even gotten like 100 pages in yet. So this is on page 25. So she says, where am I going here? So she says, the slaves who flocked off the ships in droves, and whose gait, features, and carriage the good people of Bridgetown mocked, were far freer than I was. For the slaves so she's reflecting on like the people who have been enslaved, who've been captured in Western Africa and brought over in ships to Barbados, and she's looking at them as they're coming off the ships. And so she says, for these slaves had not chosen their chains, they had not walked of their own accord toward a raging, awe-inspiring sea to give themselves up to the slave dealers and bend their backs to the branding iron. But that is exactly what I had done, right? So I appreciate that she names that is something that she's done in her decision to, again, get married and to marry somebody who's enslaved and thereby give up her freedom for slavery. Okay, so let's get into it a little bit more. So again, they end up going to Massachusetts. She ends up being, and that's actually before, so she ends up getting pregnant by him, and she aborts the child because she decides that let me tame you. Yes. It's a thing. It's a thing. And I've talked about this with other people before as well. Like, again, I'm a high achieving Black woman. Most of the people I work with are high achieving Black women. And this desire, like, there's both a desire to have that high achiever, amazing, all the things that come with being a high achieving Black woman. There's both a desire to to have that and access that and tap into that and like psychically milk that, right? Like, to use Audre Lorde's words and uses the erotic. The erotic is power, or annex that power, as Patricia Hill Collins describes it. People want to kind of tap into that power and take advantage of the power, but also tame it, or bring it down and bring you down a notch, put you in your place, right? And so it's important to pay attention to people who feel like they want to put you in your place, right? Because it's like, I'm in my rightful place, I don't need you to put me anywhere. But there's this interesting desire to tame or bring down a notch, the big personality, the beauty, the brilliance, the sensuality, the sexuality, all of those things. Okay, so she ends up getting pregnant by him and decides she does not want to bring a child into the world. So she takes different herbs and things like that in order to abort the child. So she is able to kind of avoid the motherhood trap in that way, in the context of slavery. So I'm not going to get into all of the things that happen in terms of her getting accused of witchcraft, but basically her spirit guides her mother and her spiritual mother do come to her and tell her, like, you're going to have a hard life. A lot of things are going to go down. You're going to be accused of all of these things. But at the end of the day, you're going to be the only one who survives. Right. And so this is like the only assurance that she has is like, whatever happens in the context of like Salem and Massachusetts and everything, she will be one who survives. Right. And so there's this other moment. This is on page 79 now. She's still in Massachusetts, and she's just reflecting on Barbados. She's missing Barbados, right? And so she says, I saw the cabin where I had spent so many happy days in solitude, right? She's reflecting back to her time when she's like in this kind of maroon state or situation. And so she says, I saw the cabin where I had spent so many days in solitude, which I now realize had been the best of all possible worlds. My cabin had not changed a bit, just a little more rickety, just a little more mossy. The trellis was laden with passion fruit. The calabash tree was showing swellings like the womb of a pregnant woman. The river Ormond was gurgling like a newborn baby. Will I ever find my way back to you, my lost, beloved country, right? So she's longing to get back to Barbados. She's longing to get back to this cabin, to this freedom that she experienced. And I love the way she's equating her joy with her solitude here, because of course she was in community, so she was not alone. Solitude and being alone are not the same thing to me, right? And so I think so often we're so socialized toward, we're socialized toward marriage, or we're socialized toward relationships, or this idea that, some other person, usually a man, in some heteronormative, relationship or family dynamic completes us or makes us who we are, or whatever the case may be. And a lot of times we're actually giving up our freedom for this idea or ideal that is never actually experienced, right? And so she has this moment of like, she's given up her freedom. She's married this man. She's become enslaved. She's now been sent off to Massachusetts. And she reflects back on this time when she was, in this cabin, had her solitude, had her freedom. And she's like, oh, those were actually the best days of my life. Again, I've been talking to my sister and one of our friends about the African Goddess Initiation book. And one of the things that she said, hey, how are you doing? One of the things that she was reflecting on was, was missing her solitude. So she had been remarried. She has children. And she's just like, every time I look up, somebody is there, right? Like, and she's like, I miss the solitude of like not having somebody like living up in my house. Like talking about the husband in particular. And so I think there is this romanticization of what marriage is, of, again, this heteronormative marriage, this nuclear family model, that is far more alienating and suppressive and oppressive than it's let on, right? And so, and again, I'm somebody, and this is why this hit close to home for me in terms of my own choices, right? Like, so I was raised in a Black church. So Tituba is not somebody who's raised in a church. Oh, actually, that's another layer of it. Like John, Indian, is, he's going through the expectations of being, a Christian and baptized and all these things. So he promises to like teach Tituba the prayers and things like that. And then of course you have the whole Puritan culture that's happening in Massachusetts. in the early America, like the kind of early formation of what becomes the United States of America. So that's also in the background, like the Christianity and the hypocrisy of Christianity coexisting with slavery and things like that. But I was raised in a church. I was raised in a Black church. So a lot of the reason why I was oriented toward marriage was because that was my upbringing, in the church. Right. And so I knew intuitively that I should not have married the person that I married. But some things happened that made me feel obligated to marry the person that I married. And it's just like, again, seeing Tituba's story, it brought up so many things in terms of my own story, even though, they're not the same, but they're enough. I see myself reflected enough in this story that I was like, again, really disturbed in the best possible way of like, oh, I do get this experience. I do get the experience of like hitting override on your intuition and going along with something, even though it doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel good, and making decisions that are not necessarily in your own best interest. And so I have gratitude that despite doing that, right, and despite as long as I stayed in it, because again, I was married for 17 years. I have 4 kids from being married for 17 years. They range in age from 13 to 24. My oldest just turned 24. Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's definitely connected. And I think that's also the power. So one of the people in the comments just said they appreciate me connecting the big text of the tradition to personal experience. And so I think that's also what some of the big texts, the power of the big text that we read, or the amazing text that we read, is that they connect to that human condition and that human experience, right? And so I think that's the power of the way that Maurice Condé tells this story of Tituba, because I think, again, it's written in like the late 1600s. I think it's like 1692-ish is like the kind of starting point, 1690s. But a lot of the reflections on relationships and sensuality and sexuality definitely still have 21st century resonances and connections. And again, there's some other layers here. I've talked about slavery. I've talked about colonialism. There are definitely some interesting analyses of whiteness that are going on, of both white maleness and white femaleness that are going on in the text. So I'm not going to get into that, but it's also layered with that. In terms of the sensuality and sexuality, there are also not explicit, but implicit gestures towards same-sex loving with Tituba and like at least one of the white women that she is in servitude to in Massachusetts. And then also when she becomes in prison after being accused of witchcraft, there's also a white woman that she's put in a prison cell with. And there are some suggestions of like sensuality and sexuality between them. So I appreciate, again, the not only the analysis of the sexual exploitation and the kind of trauma of sexuality that's happening, again, in the context of slavery and colonialism, but also like the erotic empowerment that is still present for Tituba in some of these situations more than others. Okay, so I think I last was talking about the solitude and joy, so that was on like page 79. And then again, I already said, her spirit guides let her know with everything that's going on with the accusation of witchcraft and the Salem witch trials, she's going to be the only one to survive, which was true. She does survive that whole experience. So then the other interesting thing that happens is, okay, so the way, and this also, there are also connections with, there's a whole commentary on like what we now call the prison industrial complex, because there's a prison system that's already being set up in the Americas in the 1600s, right? And so the way the prison system was set up, if you got accused of something, you basically had to pay the fees for your upkeep, whether you were guilty or not, right? So if you were white and you had access to resources, then if you were accused, you usually had a family member or somebody who could, pay whatever the fees were for you being imprisoned. But in Tituba's case, the person who, the people who'd accused her were not going to pay for her fees in order for her to get out of prison. So she's still in prison. She ends up like cooking and doing all of these things. And so what ends up happening is a Jewish man ends up coming to purchase her to be his servant, right? And so the Jewish man is somebody who had been married, his wife died, he has like 9 kids, right? And he's like, well, instead of getting married again, I'll just take on a slave or a servant, right? And so he purchases, he pays her fees, and now she's in servitude to him. And then what's interesting to me about this, so also, can we shout out to Maurice Condé that, again, she sets this in the 1600s, late 1600s, and is also dealing with, like, again, these dynamics of colonialism, slavery, race, gender, sexuality, but also she looks at these interesting parallels between the Jewish diaspora and the oppression of Jewish people, and the African diaspora and the oppression of African people. So there's this interesting point of connection between this Jewish man and Tituba in terms of his experience of having to like flee his country and go different places, and her experience of her mother like being kidnapped from the continent, brought to Barbados, and then her having to leave Barbados in order to go to Massachusetts. So there's an interesting point of connection between them, but then they end up becoming lovers, right? And so of course we can ask questions of like, if you are indebted to this person, is there a consensual relationship happening there? So we can talk about those dynamics. But she describes it as, so she's like, again, he's not an attractive person. He's older, and she's young. I want to say she's like still like 20 to 25 when some of this stuff is going on. So there's this interesting connection again between marriage and slavery. So they end up starting, having a sexual relationship. And then, she says, like when they first have sex, he says he was both surprised and ashamed. He who taught his sons that fornication was a terrible sin. So he withdrew, stammering apologies that were swept away in another wave of desire, right? Like, so they still end up having sex. So then she says, this is on page 127. Henceforth, I lived in that odd situation of being both mistress and servant, right? And so that's the situation that ends up unfolding with Tituba. But then she also says, and this is later in the next paragraph, she says, a lump would rise up in my throat and I would choke back the sobs, but that didn't last. And I pitched and heaved just as well on the sea of delight with my misshapen lover. That's what she describes this Jewish man as her misshapen lover. And she says the sweetest moments, however, were those when he talked about us and only about us, right? So then he has this is on the very next page. There's this moment, this is on page 128. So she says, one night, when we had pitched and heaved more violently than usual, Benjamin whispered passionately, "There's always a shadow in the back of your eyes, Tituba. What can I give you to make you happy or almost happy?" Right? So he has this moment. He's like, feels connected. He sees that she has this shadow in her eyes. She's unhappy. What can I do to make you happy or almost happy? And she says, "My freedom." She says these words rushed out of their own accord. He stared at me in amazement. "Freedom, but what would you do with it?" And she says, "I would take a berth on one of your ships and set sail immediately from my Barbados," right? So he asks her what she wants. She says her freedom. And then he gets mad at her because like he wasn't expecting her to say she wanted her freedom. So she says, his face hardened and I scarcely recognized him. "Never, never, you hear me," is what he says to her. "If you leave, I'll lose her a second time. Don't ever mention it again." And so what he's talking about is his wife has died, and Tituba has the spiritual connection for him to be able to see and communicate with his wife, right? And so he's willing to keep her enslaved, again, as his servant, so that he can continue to access her spiritual powers in order to be able to continue to communicate with his wife, right? So this is, again, another moment of truth of like, he asked her what she wanted. She said what she wanted. And he was just like, basically, no, I'm not going to give it to you. But then what happens is they get attacked because he's Jewish, the Jewish family, the Protestants, or the puritanical white Christian folks are not trying to have these Jewish people in their neighborhood, let alone one who's like living with Tituba, who's again his servant, but I'm sure they know something's going on with him. So again, all the spoilers, I'm not holding back anything that happens. So basically they burn down his house with all his kids in it. And so he and Tituba are the only ones who survive from that house being burned down. And then he has this moment of realization that he's being punished. So he says, he's like, I'm not being punished because we had sex. He says I'm being punished because I refused you the only thing you desire, your freedom, because I have kept you by force using the violence he condemns, because I have been selfish and cruel. So he has this moment of realization of like, I am, yes, exactly. Her full happiness is actually absolutely too much. So he has this realization, like, again, he's already lost his wife. His house gets burned down. He loses all his children. And he's like, oh, I realize I'm being punished because I did not grant you the freedom that you asked for. So he's basically like, I will now give you your freedom. And then Tituba is like, no, I don't want my freedom. And I'm like, girl, what are we doing? What are we doing? So she like has this moment where after asking for her freedom, and he's like, yes, I'm going to give you what you asked for, then she wants to reject it. And she's like, no, I want to stay here with you. It doesn't matter. And fortunately, he doesn't listen to her. So he goes ahead and gets her papers together so that she can travel legally, gets her a ticket on board a ship so she can go back to Barbados, right? But wait, there's more. So she gets back to Barbados, and she ends up connecting with the Maroons in Barbados, right? And so again, she still has her place that she built up. I think it's like maybe a decade that's passed since she's left and when she goes back. So that spot is still there. But she ends up like meeting some people on the ship, goes to connect with these Maroons. And so one of the leaders of the Maroon community, of course, wants to hook up with her, right? And also, again, there's this, the ongoing rumors that she's a witch. They recognize her spiritual powers. And so everybody, again, wants to tap into that power, tap into that energy. And so this guy who's leading the Maroon community is basically like, I want you to use your powers to make me invincible. And so she goes to Mama Yaya and her mom again, and they're like, that's not a thing. We're not doing that. But also, girl, like this dude, like, so with each of the, like with the first husband, the mother is like, that is just like a braggadocious fool. Like, he has no sense. Like, why are you even interested in him? And they're similarly eye rolling at this guy who's like one of the leaders in this Maroon community. And so she ends up, sleeping with a guy who's in a Maroon community. His wives end up getting, upset and jealous. And so it becomes a whole thing. And again, it starts out with like this it always starts out sweet and then turns sour and bitter when the man can't exercise the control that he wants to exercise over Tituba, right? And so something similar happens here. I think Christopher or Christoph is the name of this guy in the Maroon community. He's trying to get her to make him immortal, invincible. And she's like, that's not a thing. I can't do it. And he turns sour on her. And so it goes from them having like these consensual sexual encounters to these non-consensual sexual encounters where she's like, he just comes in and he takes me without even taking his clothes off. And so she does. And then there's a moment where she says, hold on, let me find it. I'm sure I quote it. So they're having this conversation about the song. So he's like, there are these songs about these, different kind of heroic figures that fought back in the context of slavery and things like that. And so she asked him like, well, what about me? Is there a song for me? And he's like, no, there's no song for you. Right. So she says, he pretended to listen hard. And he said, no, there isn't. And then he began to snore and he just like goes to sleep. Right. So he's basically like, you're not worthy of a song. Right. And this is also part of Maurice Condé's, intention with writing the book, is that she wanted to be able to write a fully developed story about this Black woman that was not just Black woman accused of witchcraft in the Salem witch trials, right? So this is her again fleshing that out, right? So now we're on page 155, where again, this is where she's getting into it with this man in the Maroon community. So she says, one evening he blurted out, "You're nothing but a common negress, but you want to be treated like someone special." Now, this is the same man that came to her believing she had the power to make him immortal. And when he can't get what he wants, again, it's like, it's another more intense version of let me tame you. Now it's like, you're nobody. Why do you think you're special? Why do you want to be treated special? So she says, I knew then that I had to go and my presence was no longer wanted. She says, just before dawn, I called Mama Yaya and Abina. Abina, again, is her biological mother. Who for some days now had kept away as if they were refusing to witness my downfall, right? So it's like her spirit guides were like, girl, what are you doing? We're not even going to sit here and watch this. But she ends up calling on them and they give her a talking to. So she says, I had to beg them. This is on page 155. I had to beg them to come when they had appeared. And when they had appeared, filling the hut with their perfume of guava and rosewood, they stared at me reproachfully. Your hair is already turning gray and you still can't do without men, is what her mother says. She said, I didn't answer. After a while, I decided to look them straight in the face. I'm going home. And so with that, she ends up leaving. But wait, there's more. So she leaves and then she does have this moment again of solitude where she's able to reconnect. So she has this healing moment where she like goes to the ocean. She like heals. She's working through all of these things. And so she says, right. She says, my working day was very simple. I got up at dawn. I prayed. I went down to bathe in the river. I had a bite to eat. Then I spent my time on my explorations and healing. And so she goes through this whole healing journey. And then what happens? Somebody who's a kid, a young boy on one of the plantations, ends up getting beat like almost to death. They actually think he's been beaten to death. And so they're going to carry him to bury him. And then they realize that he's still breathing, and they bring him to her because they believe that she can heal her. I mean, she can heal this kid from this plantation. And so she does end up, she comes up with, again, all of these herbs and ointments and prayers, and she's able to heal him and bring him back. And then he comes back like, you know, with a vengeance and with anger, like, we need to take down the system of slavery. We need to fight the enslavers, all of this kind of stuff. So he basically has like revolution, rebellion on his mind. And so for a while he calls her mother, and then things shift. Oh, and then she also discovers that she's pregnant by the maroon guy, and she decides that she's gonna keep that baby. So this is chapter 14 when she figures out that she's pregnant by him. So she says, I realized that I was pregnant. To start with, I couldn't believe it. Wasn't I an old woman with flat, withered breasts hanging over my ribcage? And again, she's only in her 20s at this point. Nevertheless, I had to face facts. Christopher's brutal embraces had conceived what the love of my Jew had not been able to. So again, she's still reflecting in this loving way about this Jewish person who bought her out of prison, and now is saying basically like as a result of the of rape. She doesn't use the word rape, but you know, she's like, there were these violent sexual encounters that she had with Christopher. She ends up getting pregnant. And so what's interesting about this part is that she then reflects on, this is now in the next chapter, I'm thinking about here, like the relationships between mothers and daughters and what we put on our children, right? Because she says, she has a sense that it's a daughter. And so she says, my daughter would settle old scores for me. She would know how to win the love of a man with a heart as warm as cornbread, and he would be faithful to her. They would have children, and they would teach to see beauty in themselves, children who would grow straight and free toward the sky. And I read that and I'm like, that's heartbreaking to me, because on the one hand, yes, I think it is important to imagine healthy, whole, loving relationships. On the other hand, I think it is like, I think that becomes the trap that we started out with, right? Like this imagined version of this heterosexual nuclear family, although again, there are same sex loving relationships that are reflected in the text. But it's this interesting desire for this illusion of this perfect nuclear family situation that she's already kind of projected onto her unborn child to like redeem all of these kind of failed relationships that she's had at this point. I was going to say in large part due to the guys, but also, you know, she made her choices as well. So then what happens is even more interesting. This kid, now that she has healed and brought back to wholeness, who's working on his rebellion, then he shifts from calling her mother to calling her Tituba, and has a moment of like, well, have you ever thought that maybe I don't want to be your son, or I don't want to be considered your son? So then they have this fit of passion, and then they end up sleeping with each other. And so it's really fascinating. And so she has a moment where she says, you know, I had this absurd feeling of committing incest, because she, you know, he was calling her mother even though she didn't not give birth to him. So she has this feeling of committing incest, and she says, I felt a wave fill up inside of me. It picked up strength and urgency, and then it broke. It flooded me, it flooded him, it flooded us, and took us under several times to the point where we lost our breath and choked and begged to stop, right? So again, they have this deeply erotic experience with each other. He does know that she's pregnant. He knows he's pregnant with this other person, with this other man's kid. And then that kind of gets us to the end of the book, where basically the plot that he had with the other people who were enslaved, the plot gets out. And so they come to the hut, and they're arrested, and they end up being hanged. So she ends up suffering the same fate that her mother suffered of being hanged. She's with child, and so her daughter never makes it into the world. But again, there's a lot I'm leaving out of it, but the core things that were standing out to me, again, in addition to these broader themes of enslavement and colonialism and race and gender dynamics, was this, like, what I consider my happily unmarried journey. And so like it just felt like so many of the ways that she describes these relationships describes the ways that we end up, black women high achievers in particular, I'm thinking about the ways that we engage with men who are like average and not all that interesting, and we like do all of these things and go above and beyond in ways that are not warranted or justified, and then get punished for it. And so it was a reminder to me of like, I feel so much gratitude for my good life choices that I decided to liberate myself from the institutional bondage that is marriage. So I often say I have a trinity of oppressions or forms of institutional bondage that I have liberated myself from. So the first one is the Black church. That was a source of institutional bondage for me. Again, in terms of forming a rejection of sensuality and sexuality in the body and all kinds of other things, right? So I still consider myself to be a deeply spiritual person, but not under the confines of like Christian religion and the ways that, like in the way that I was raised. So like I left the church when I was like 30 years old, and I have zero regrets about that. And I love the spiritual practices that I have that sustain me now, right? So that was number one. Number two was the institution of marriage. And again, I entered into the institution of marriage because I was raised in the institution of the church. And I'm just so glad that even though it took me 17 years to get out of it, I'm glad that I was able to get out of it. And in my decision on the other side of leaving those institutions have always, it's been amazing. Like the other side of those difficult decisions have always been amazing and rewarding in ways that I could not have thought about, right? So leaving the church was not me leaving God or spirit guides or spiritual practices. It was opening myself up to new, more empowered ways of practicing spirituality and feeling connected to that which is greater than me, right? So it's like liberating myself by leaving. I left the constraints of, again, this institutional bondage of the church and was able to embrace something far greater and better for me, right? And the same thing with leaving the institution of marriage, right? Leaving the institution of marriage freed me up. I often say my happily unmarried journey runs parallel to my erotic empowerment journey, right? So I felt very erotically disempowered in the context of the marriage, right? And before the marriage. But it was like after I liberated myself from the institution of marriage that I then became open to like the possibilities of like, what does my sensuality and sexuality and power look like, right? And so guided by beautiful, brilliant Black women, literary people, right? Like Maurice Condé and Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, of course, Audre Lorde. Like I'm working on a book on Audre Lorde now. It was Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic as power, that really let me tap into my sensuality and sexuality in a different way. To think about not just sensuality and sexuality, but also creativity and also purpose and other kinds of things that Audre Lorde gets into in the uses of the erotic essay, right? So my happily unmarried journey ran parallel to and helped motivate and inspire my erotic empowerment journey. Hey, good to see you. And then after that, it was the academy. Number three, the third part of that trinity of institutional bondage that I liberated myself was the institution of the academy. And so I was a professor for 20 years. I was very good at it. I had multiple books, right? Like there's my Rent book, there's my Beauvoir book. And I still write books. I'm still a scholar and a writer. I'm working on a book on Audre Lorde now. But I realized that it was no longer aligned for me, right? And so the things that I really initially loved about the academy when I first started, it was no longer a thing, right? And so when I assess what are the things that I love about this job and what are the things that I frankly hate about this job or dislike about this job, I realized the things that I loved, I didn't have to do as a professor, right? So I loved research. I loved writing. I loved speaking. I loved, mentoring and teaching in a particular, not in a traditional classroom sense, but in the way, like the relationships that I had with graduate students and other faculty members and things like that. And I realized I didn't have to be a professor in order to continue to be a scholar and a writer and a public speaker and to continue to connect with people, right? And so I was able to create La Belle Vie Academy as a space where I could do those things on my own terms without all of the institutional bondage and extraction. And again, what Patricia Hill Collins calls annexing of power, and what Audre Lorde calls the psychic milking that happens in these institutional structures, right? The institutions are always going to institution. And at a certain point, the benefits that I was getting from being within the institution did not outweigh the consequences of like how misaligned I felt in that space. And so I walked away from that. And I have zero regret. That was in 2023. It's 2025 now. So I'm like almost 2 years out, like a year and a half out. It'll be 2 years this summer. And I have zero regrets about that as well. So yeah, those are my reflections on Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. Shout out to Maurice Condé for this amazing book. Again, there's a lot of layers and other things going on, but for me, what most stood out was the importance of being happily unmarried and not getting caught up with these with these people who are like not very remarkable, very average and mediocre at best, and yet we, not giving ourselves over to that. So I appreciate, so I'm definitely in a very different place now. Like I am no longer on that train of giving myself over in that way. But again, what it brought up for me is all the ways that I did that with the choices that I made with the person that I married. And I also am filled with gratitude again for my happily unmarried and delightfully divorced journey. And so yeah, of course, I've been doing this stuff through La Belle Vie Academy. So I'm still writing. I still have La Belle Vie Writers. So shout out to La Belle Vie Writers because they've been with me every step of the way as I'm working on this Audre Lorde book now. I also have, of course, my exit strategies course that people in La Belle Vie Writers have access to for people who also are professors who want to do their own exit strategy from the academy. So there are course suites that people have access to do that in La Belle Vie Writers. And that's also like a standalone course if you don't want to do La Belle Vie Writers, but you do want to do exit strategies. That's available. And then this really made me think about my high achievers and erotic empowerment courses and programming that I'm doing. So I am there's a link in my bio for people if you're interested in doing the Happily Unmarried and or erotic empowerment stuff with me. I'm going to be doing like some group coaching programming kind of stuff. And there's also like a course suites associated with that. So there's a link in my bio that has one says Happily Unmarried, one says Erotic Empowerment. So you can sign up for the wait list for that, so that as I start making the announcements about those things in the coming weeks, that you'll be the first person or among the first to hear about those announcements as they come out. And we can get into some of this. And I do incorporate some literature and fiction. So I, like, as somebody was saying earlier, I am very intentional and good at bringing together what's happening in some of these texts that we're reading, philosophical texts, Black feminist texts, Black women's literature, and what's happening in my own life and what's happening in all of our lives, right? And so that is definitely my approach to not only how I engage in La Belle Vie Writers, but also how I engage with high achievers and happily unmarried. So get on that email list if you're interested in hearing more about that. And again, those announcements will be coming out in the coming weeks. So I will be happy to connect with people on those things. But thank you for hanging out with me. It's been almost an hour, but I'm glad that I got into it. I've been itching to do this all week, but I was like, let me wait till Friday for Friday Feels so that I can just do a deep dive with and, look at my tabs and read some quotes and things like that. But yes to Maurice Condé and Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. Thank you. I'm so glad that you could join me. I appreciate you. Gonna read it again. Yes, I was like, as soon as I saw her in the African Goddess book, I was like, okay, I have to reread Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, and it's good. Like, again, there's frustrations. Like I think you will be similarly frustrated as I was with some of the decisions that Tituba makes. But again, the frustration is because we see ourselves in Tituba. It's like, yes, I too have practiced some self-abandonment and self-betrayal in the interest of for me it was in the context of the marriage, but we live, we learn, we make different kind of choices. So gratitude that we didn't have to, like, again, we can count the different consequences and challenges that came with certain relationships that we've been in, but they have not cost us our freedom in this regard, right? And so we are able to come back from those decisions better than ever, more informed, and just try to share our experiences so other people hopefully coming after us don't have to experience the same thing, or also just to hold space for people who have done similar things and don't have to feel like shame and blame and all kinds of things. Like, you don't have to stay stuck in those decisions, right? Like, there's always an opportunity to do something different, to do what I call pause and pivot. Like, you can pause, assess the situation, and pivot and choose to do something differently, right? Like, you can always reconnect to your sense of agency, your sense of self, your lineage. Like, I love that Tituba had access to this kind of matrilineal connection to spiritual power and spiritual practice, right? Like, again, with her mother and her spiritual mother, who are still with her even when they're disappointed about the decisions that she makes, right? And so I think it's important for us to have these very intergenerational, interconnected communities where we can have these conversations and hold space for each other, and hold each other accountable without cutting each other off necessarily. Like, so I appreciate that Abina and Mama Yaya are like, we disagree with you, They're looking at her reproachfully, but they don't abandon her. You know, they still support her and encourage her when she like comes to her senses. And so we all need some of that as well. So happy Friday, everybody. Sending all the love and positive energy. I will be doing, I did a round of bringing people in for La Bellevue Writers at the end of December, early January. And then I'm going to do another round of opening that back up in mid-March. So some social media stuff will be going out about that for people who are interested in La Bellevue Writers. And then, like I said, if you jump on the email list for Happily Unmarried and or Erotic Empowerment, then you'll get some emails about that stuff as well. But happy Friday. I hope you have an amazing weekend. And I will see you guys the next time I'm on here. Okay, bye.